for all of its achievements in putting Palestinians as a reality before the world and putting the Palestinian cause before the world, the PLO subsequently signed an agreement at Oslo with which you were in profound
disagreement. But one mustn't forget what happened during the rest of that decade of the 70s. I mean, the PLO for the first time established Palestinian institutions. So there was a research center, there was a health service, there was a sense in which we had become a kind of nation in exile or in waiting. And this was also the period where we were two things at the same time. We were a liberation movement that attracted most of the world's liberation movements. Beirut became a capital for people. Well, I'll give you an example. When Mariam and I went to South Africa in '91, we met people at the ANC Mandela had just been released. It was May of '91. And we went to the ANC headquarters in downtown Joburg, and we saw people that I had seen in Beirut in the 70s who had come there when the ANC was, outlawed in South Africa. Many of the Sandinistas turned up, various people from Ireland, Cubans, and so on.
And also on the other side, Carlos.
That's always been there. All of those people, right, of course. And in a certain sense, I regretted that aspect of the PLO, which was particularly, I think, allowed by Arafat in the 80s, in the 70s rather. That is to say, many factions, and he would play them off against each other. There was never, like the FLN, whether the Algerian or the Vietnamese, a kind of central thing. It was always factions, and there was a Syrian faction, there was an Iraqi faction, there was a Marxist-Lenin, and so it was a chaos, but it was, in many ways, a rather creative chaos, with regrettable and unfortunate sides, until '82, at which point the siege of Beirut took place and the PLO was banished. And Arafat became an exile for the next 10 years. And during those 10 years, during the 80s, he was in Tunisia. And being a member of the National Council, and I knew him quite well, I went often to Tunisia, whether for meetings or to talk with him. And my main concern was was to try to inform him and his people about the United States. I already in 1979 in Beirut had given a lecture in which I forecast, I won't say prophesied, but I forecast the fact that they would be negotiated with the Americans in a matter of time, because it was inevitable. And no matter what the Israelis did during the Intifada, for example, the first Intifada of the late 80s, 87 to 92, they were never able to dislodge the PLO, even among people on the West Bank and Gaza. They tried, for example, it was the Israelis who encouraged Hamas and established it. Peres himself was in charge of that.
And the Islamic University in Gaza.
All of that, as alternatives to the PLO, but that simply strengthened the PLO. I mean, there's this thing about Palestine. I think most people who are oppressed will resist by being, more stubborn in their beliefs and convictions, and wanting to go on. And all the efforts that were made to get Palestinians to move never succeeded with the Palestinians of Palestine. The Palestinians in Jordan, who were driven out in '71 by Hussein and by the Hashemites, and then again in '82 by the Israelis, ended up, one has to say it, ironically, by returning to Palestine, which is what happened with Arafat. But I knew that the U.S. was going to play an important role, and what I was very early struck by was the fact that not just the PLO, but most of the Arabs, the educated Arabs, many of whom had been in America, educated in America, whether they were Egyptian or Syrian or Iraqi or Lebanese or Palestinian, really didn't, in my opinion, have a deep enough understanding of what America was and what it would be like to negotiate with them. Of course, we had examples. There were the Vietnamese talks, and a very good guide in all of this was my friend Iqbal Ahmad, whom I took to Beirut in 1980, introduced him to Arafat, and he was the first one to explain to them that just having a lot of soldiers in South Lebanon and maybe 2 tanks, which is all they had, would be as nothing to an Israeli invasion. And he prophesied what the Israelis would do almost to the letter. But there was so much investment in conventional ideas about defense that were taken from the Arab armies, which had a very distinguished record of success, that they didn't listen to him. And of course, what he emphasized and what I got out of it was that we need to be creative and innovative and original in our thinking, and really try to work with groups inside Israel and and in the West and so on, and focus on that. So when Arafat was in Tunis, that long moratorium when he was, you know, high and dry, I would bring people to Tunis to talk to him about America, about resistance, about liberation, etc. It was hopeless, because in the end, what I could see right through the 80s was a very, very conventional mindset, where his model of rule was, I don't know, Hafez al-Assad in Syria, that if you could get to Hafez al-Assad and whisper in his ear, it would be done. You know, so he figured if you could get to the top American, then that was the end of your problem. And so the top American was you know, the president. And since, you know, because I was in this ironic position of being a member of the American establishment through my education, you know, being at Princeton and watching, say, during the Carter administration, classmates of mine in the State Department. So it was easy for me to have access. But I realized it wasn't enough, and so I was in this feverish situation of trying to explain. And then I didn't realize at the time, neither I nor Ibrahim, you know, that this was a period when he was, you know, doing his best to contact the State Department to make himself more attractive. And the way he did it, looking back on it, was to make more concessions than anyone else. In other words, he understood. I mean, he's a extremely canny, even brilliant tactician. He represented himself as the only person who could actually deliver the Palestinians. And as time went on after the Gulf War, when he sided with Saddam, I began to be quite disenchanted with him. There were other things when I criticized him openly in the Arab press through an interview I gave in '88 and '89. Our relationship became quite fraught. But I didn't realize how far he would go. And after the Gulf War and the Madrid conference, by that time I was already ill, and I felt very alienated. I realized that he was up to something. And I could see that the West Bank and Gaza delegation that had been appointed to negotiate with the Americans and the Israelis in Washington were a front for him, and that the real, you know, sort of behind-the-scenes power was Arafat himself, who had a man, Nabil Shaath, on that committee, reporting back to him. So whenever they took a very strong stand against the Israelis in their negotiations, Shaath would telephone Arafat, and then Arafat, through Shaath, would undercut their position by offering less, offering more. And of course the Israelis understood that, and they would then, you know, stiffen. And gradually he drew the Israelis to him, and then, as you know, they started having these secret meetings in Oslo and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There were a whole set of meetings that took place in '92 that led finally to Oslo and the signing on the White House lawn in September of 1993.
Now, most of the world praised that signing and said, and possibly even believed, that it was peace at last between Israelis and Palestinians. You were one of the few Palestinians, Haider al-Shafi was another, to say, no, this is a sham. But
yeah.
Why did you say it was a sham?
Well, A, because I knew what was in the text. I mean, I remember talking again to Nabil Shaath, who was not at Oslo, but he had been telling me how much the Shamir government was you know, sort of blocking any agreement during the ongoing. Of course, I didn't realize that he was feeding Arafat all this stuff, and that he was taken quite by surprise. But he immediately, being the loyalist that he is, you know, put a very bright face on it. He said, you know, that they've done it. I said, listen, Nabil, I've seen the text. There's no mention of the end of the occupation. There's nothing about settlements. I mean, these people are going to go on planning settlements, and he said they're only 1%. I said, 1% of what? What are you talking about? He said, well, on land surface. I said, you don't know the area. Man, not that I had been there, but none of the people who negotiated had been to the West Bank and Gaza, didn't realize what we were talking about. I had some idea, certainly more than them, and I'd looked at the maps. So there was nothing about the stopping of settlements. There was nothing about Jerusalem. There was nothing about refugees. There was nothing about sovereignty. It was a complete sham, I thought. I was outraged by the document, and I was astonished at the lengths to which Arafat went to make himself, to market himself as an apostle of peace and the man who was finally, you know, reconciling himself with the Israelis. That was number one. And number two, I also had spent years studying the Israelis, and I realized that if they were going to be as concessive as the world seemed to think, they would have said something more explicit. All you had to do was look dramatically, as it were, at the two documents, the letters that were exchanged between the PLO and the Israeli government. The Israeli government letter to the PLO was 1.5 lines, in which it says, the government of Israel recognizes that the PLO is the representative of the Palestinian people. Sincerely, Rabin. The Palestinian letter was 1.5 pages long, written by Arafat and his people, single-spaced, apologizing for terrorists, saying that we've taken back this, we're not going to do this again, we recognize Israel, the right to live in peace, recognize more, all this stuff, dealing with a state that until today still hasn't declared its international borders. I mean, it's the only state in the UN that has no recognized international borders, and still doesn't to this day. And this apologetic stuff from them, and they got, very, in my opinion, very little in return. So I was, quite outraged by this, and when they invited me, I was invited 4 or 5 times, kind of a snafu in the White House, by various secretaries and so on who invited me to the ceremony. I refused to go. I said it was a day of infamy. And that very night, as if to confirm what I'd been saying, the BBC did an interview with me and with Amos Oz, one of the leading Israeli novelists and a member of Peace Now. It was done by Michael Ignatieff, and Oz went first, and then I came after Oz. So Oz concluded, Ignatieff said to him, well, what do you think about this? And he said, this is the second greatest victory of Zionism, this document. And of course I knew what he meant, that it was a victory, that they had, sort of seduced the Palestinians into basically giving up and signing everything over on placing all their hopes on the Israelis and the Americans, who, if you knew anything about either, certainly didn't have Palestinian interests at heart. And of course I took off on that because my interview came after, and I went into all of these things. And of course from then until about 1995 or 6, I became an enemy of Arafat, and people would badmouth me, and they say that I'm a wet blanket, and I was jealous because I hadn't been given a ministerial job. And that was the last thing in my mind. I didn't want to work in a position of that sort. But I really was. I was terribly disheartened, and it was at a moment when I was getting sicker. But I felt that it was a moment where you had to either have determination and press on, even if it meant quite literally for years being alone and attacked. And my books were banned by Arafat in 1996.
I remember you were in the unusual predicament of having your books banned by Arafat in the Palestinian areas, but not banned in Israel.
Not banned in Israel, exactly. I mean, it was quite terrible. And not only that, but to show the mendacity of the regime and the kind of mentality he established. He taught Palestinians how to lie. I felt that the person who signed the edict against me, banning my books, refused to acknowledge that he signed it. And a couple of years later, this was in '96. A couple of years later, I ran into him in the American Colony Hotel. He was a minister in Arafat. He's still a minister in Arafat's government. And I said to him, "How could you do that?" He said, "I had nothing to do with it." I said, "But it was signed on stationery from the Ministry of Culture and Information, and you're both." He said, "No, I had nothing to do with it. You've got the wrong idea." And even friends of mine who were in the government said, "We know nothing about this thing." But wherever you went, you couldn't get the books, or, my books were, because they were in Arabic. That's it. They had been translated from English, from my columns, put together in a fairly cheap edition, all about Oslo, from Cairo, and they were immediately distributed all over the West Bank. So that went on until it became intolerable for most Palestinians, and gradually the tide turned and opinion went my way.
Because circumstances got worse.
Yeah, circumstances got worse, and Arafat and his people tried often during the 90s to arrange meetings with me, etc., but I refused to have anything to do with them. I remember once somebody asked me this on an American talk show. He said, "Well, what are your relationships with Chairman Arafat?" Because I used to be known as Arafat's man in New York during the 80s. And I said, "Well, I have nothing to do with him. I think, he did something very bad. And is he in touch with you?" I said, "Yeah, he's in touch with me, but I don't answer." "Well, doesn't that show that he's a more decent person than you are?" I said, "Yeah, I suppose he is. He's a great man, and I'm not." But I was frequently asked by his people whether I would meet with him. And I said, yeah, of course I'd meet with him, but on one condition. They said, what? That it be a public meeting. And that we would meet on the stage of a theater or a assembly hall, and we would discuss the issues in public. They started to laugh. They said, you know, he can't accept that. I said, then what does he want from me? He just wants you to, you know, after all, it's a common struggle, all that nonsense. So I absolutely refused. I never saw him. The last time I saw him was in the summer of '92. He was recuperating after his operation in a Jordanian palace. And Mariam and the children and I had just come from the West Bank, and it was exactly the day of the elections that had brought the Labour Party to power, and we presaged the whole, you know, march to Oslo. I saw him then. I've never seen him since.
But you did go back during the Oslo period, and
yeah, frequently.
As I recall, in one of your films, confronted soldiers who were in the process of taking land.
Yeah, I mean, it was a complete coincidence. A film I made in '98. And, you know, we did the usual thing. It was a kind of, it was a personal kind of film, a narrative about In Search of Palestine, and we went and filmed the house and, you know, places I knew and all this sort of thing. Talked with, did an interview with Mahmoud Darwish, you know, the great poet who was a friend of mine, and with Daniel Barenboim, with Brahim Abdullah, various people. Anyway, and we're near the end of the shoot, and we're on our way to Hebron, to Khalil. And as we were driving along the road, there was this extraordinary sight I saw, which completely riveted me, and I asked them to stop the car. And there was this quite obviously fertile field, you know, a small one. In the back, sort of on the horizon, was a village, and this was obviously part of the village land. And there was this Israeli bulldozer plowing up the field and tearing up the trees. And there were this small group of Palestinian men in their hattas and, you know, standing there and sort of arguing with 2-3 Israeli soldiers. So we immediately stopped, we got down, and I immediately inquired from one of the men what was happening. And he said, this is our land, they've decided to take it. And I said, how could that be? So I went over to the Israeli soldier. I was really incensed, you know. And I said to him, well, what are you doing? He said, well, we're enlarging the road. And I said, listen, I have a camera, and I think, would you speak on camera? He said, no, we're not allowed to talk on camera. So, you know, if you have your camera here, I'll either smash it or you turn it off. So we turned it off, and I talked with him. But we recorded some of it, you know, voice recorded. And he proceeded to tell me that they were expanding the road. It happened to be a settler's road, you know, which they were building. And I think I was the only person in America who was commenting on this road system that was being built, which you could see. But none of the reporters, you see, who were talking about peace and, you know, and reconciliation between Palestinians and cooperation. And of course, and all the NGOs and the Ford Foundation and the aid agency were sponsoring seminars and projects. And a whole new class was emerging of NGOs who cooperated with Israel. And there were dialogues and all fig leaves for this horrible expansion, this metastasis of the thing. What then happened was that I said to him, you know, this man is telling you that his livelihood depends on it, and you just tell me it's the land of Israel. What kind of inhumanity is that? He said, listen, think of it this way. We've sent people to the moon. We build cars. This road, and he pointed to the settler road, he said this road needs to be expanded. So in order to do that, you have to excavate more land and take more land away. I said, yeah, but you're killing the trees, you're killing the crops. He said, it doesn't matter, it's progress. And then he refused to say anything. And then the worst thing, I think that, I'm not even sure we got it in the film, was that I went back to him after I talked to the men, and I said, well, I mean, what about Oslo? What about these agreements that you made with the Palestinians? He said, no, this is being done with the knowledge of the authorities. So I asked one of the Palestinians, is that true? He said, yes, he came and he talked with them, and apparently, then I found out that what the Israelis had done during that period, it was in '98, they would announce in the local press, there would be like a box or something saying that we're going to come and take land for the road, the expansion of the road on such and such a date. So rather than dramatizing that, the Sultan or the authority would go along with it, would say nothing. They had been informed. Maybe people had been bought off, but that's where I felt really the failure of Oslo, was the inability of Arafat and his people to protect their own people. I mean, that was, to me, the great crime. Not that the people were unwilling to sacrifice, that they weren't willing to march and, and to be steadfast, sumud as it's called in Arabic, but rather that the authority showed no care for them, and that's the thing that I found most. Just as the Israelis didn't care about them, neither did the authority. And earlier that week, I recall another terrible sequence similar to this one, where there was a group of Bedouin who had been living in the Jordan Valley, not far from Jerusalem, actually, on the way to the Jahalin. I saw what they did. And I got there just after the Israelis had been there, and I saw that these people were out, their tents had been destroyed. They were sitting out in the open, exposed. It was a rather severe early spring. It was February or March or something. And it was raining and cold, and there was children running around, and dogs, and women huddling together, and it was a heart-rending sight. And the men spread this blanket or rug, and we sat together, and they made me tea, and we started to talk. And then as we talked, I asked them questions about have they been helped by anybody. He said, oh yes, the Red Crescent came, and the Red Cross came. And Faisal Husseini, who died earlier, about a year ago, in 2001, who was the representative for Jerusalem, had come. And they'd all been very kind, and they brought us blankets. So I said, very good. And then we stopped filming, and then I told one of the men informally, I said, it's really good what you said, that they cared and they came. He said, no, I just said that for the camera. Nobody's paid any attention to us.
And they've been moved again.
I know. They're constantly being moved from one place to the other.
During this Oslo period, the Palestinian Authority appears to have cooperated with land seizures, as you've said. More than that, ministers in the Arafat government were financially benefiting by selling building materials and being involved in the actual construction of settlements, Jamil Tarifi, for example. Why is it that the Palestinians, for all of their relative level of education compared to the rest of the Arab world and sophistication, have ended up with a leadership that so badly serves them?
I think it's an impossible question to answer. It's certainly been the fact of my life that ever since I can remember, we've been very badly served by leaders to whom we seem loyal. And the only thing I can offer by way of explanation is that there is this tremendously fraught sense of precariousness surrounding Palestinians as a collectivity. And if a reassuring kind of father figure appears, people flock to him. And because our lives and worlds are made up of bad news, if they offer, as Arafat always does, good news, or better, or more important, he doesn't say anything at all. I mean, since, from the beginning of Oslo until now, he hardly has addressed his people, which he could do very easily himself, and explain to them, as Mandela does, or did, as other leaders have. And yet people, are loyal to him. And whenever he's humiliated, as he has been recently by the Israelis, they stand by him. And I think we come back now to the question of intellectuals. I think the worst offenders in this are not the ordinary people who are just, hanging on to life and trying to make a go of it, and for them it's easy to, but the intellectual class, the one that benefited from the NGOs and the huge amount of money in projects that were poured in for human rights. For example, all these study centers that were established on the West Bank, somebody counted by the middle 90s something about 65 or 70 of them. The study of women, Palestinian heritage, folklore, every conceivable kind. Not a single one was established for the study of Israeli society. And that would be serious, teaching people Hebrew to understand what we're dealing with, what the history is, what the reality. None of that. It's all personal advancement. The absence, very important, I think, and I've been very conscious of this in my own work, the absence of role models. To who do you model your work and life on? After the death of Abdel Nasser, really the whole idea of a role model in the Arab world, somebody who tried to sacrifice, who remained true to a cause that didn't work for money. It wasn't co-opted by a regime. You couldn't say about Haidar Abdel-Shafi, for example, that he was in the pay of the Egyptians, or he was really executing orders from Arafat or Hafiz al-Assad or Saddam. those kinds of people really disappeared from the scene. And third was the complete corruption of journalism. Journalism becomes who owns the paper. And very cleverly, as so many people in his position have done before in the Arab world and elsewhere, Arafat bought up all the papers. So that one of the most shocking stories of all is when there was a Christmas Eve service and he went to the Church of the Nativity, and he sat next to the cardinal, you know, the Catholics, and he wanted to. The picture, I don't know, inadvertently was put on page 3. He hauled in the editor and threw him in jail for 2 weeks for not putting the picture on the front page. So that the newspaper is thought of as just part of his authority rather than an independent source of news. And as I say, I think it is the intellectual class that never really stood up to him. And only recently, with the complete failure and the absence of any kind of authority under this sort of permanent brutal Israeli siege of destroying the infrastructure, of making life impossible, has there emerged a group of people who realize that in the end, you know, they're the people, the teachers, the doctors, the lawyers, you know, who are going to have to keep the society going, and it's held together. It's held together. Of course, family plays a very important part, not tribalism, family. It's a different thing. Tribe suggests something anthropologically sort of aberrant. But families and a connection to the land, in spite of Arafat and his people. And slowly examples of, like, again, my friend Abu Lughod, who went back and really set an example for others that he gave up in America. You know, he was a prosperous, or at least well-off professor. He owned his own house. He lived in a Chicago suburb. He was a respected member of the community, as we say, and he went back and lived in Ramallah and offered his services for nothing to the university. That has been missing. And finally, and ironically, it's been missing not in the people who are, you know, who need to do it, who need jobs, but it's the people who don't need jobs that are the ones who are, you know, the superbly well-educated, the well-off, the people who would survive. I mean, just because their skills and their background give them enough of a head start. They're the ones who, alas, always are flirting with Arafat, and you want to be called into the cabinet and want to get a ministry and that sort of thing. It's extremely disappointing.
But can we go a bit deeper on that point of Arafat's leadership? The one way that I might see it, and you might not, I don't know, is that Arafat and other Arab leaders behave in their societies very much like Arab fathers in their families. So the Arafat would never be able to sit with you any more than a father could sit to be questioned by his son in an Arab family. And I think this emerges in your own memoirs and your father. I don't think any Arab leader could afford to sit down with one of his subjects, one of his citizens, and be questioned one-to-one by him.
No, I think they could. I think you're wrong. I think they could, but they rely very heavily, just as Arafat relies, and I don't think it's specific to Arabs, I think it's everywhere. They rely on, you might say, the authority of the authority. You know, let's say the authority of the office. It's a very intimidating factor. And it's not just about being a father, it's about holding a position, which is terribly important in Arab society, you know, and I think it's true in every society. I mean, if you're a professor in a university, I've always thought that that's the best thing to be in a university, but if you're a dean or a vice president or a provost, it's not just true in the Arab world, it's true in the West as well, then you're considered something of greater importance. I think that's it. So there's no fear for Arafat or the king of Saudi Arabia or of, the sheikh of Kuwait to sit with people. In fact, they have these diwans and people can come and talk to them in an extremely egalitarian way. It doesn't make any difference. I mean, they listen to them, but doesn't mean they're going to do anything because they know it can't affect them, right? They come as individuals. What we don't have is an informed public opinion which is mobilized, whether through the you know, in Gramscian terms, you know, that is mobilized to create a kind of hegemony through a culture of, let's say, resistance, or at least offering some challenge to the single authority. It's the authority that I think, for example, that somebody like Bush has. You know, it's just because he's the president. People venerate authority, and I think it has in the end not so much to do with families. It may be vestigial. I mean, you know, they carry with them a kind of patriarchal cachet, but it's not only that, is what I'm trying to say. I think it's the whole mechanism of power, which I've always believed it's the intellectual's role to oppose, or at least to expose and demystify, and saying, well, you know, he doesn't really have that kind of power. You have to be able to say, and most people are afraid to do that.
Well, the thing that seems to have brought the Oslo process to an end were two things. The Camp David talks, which were said to have been the most generous offer Israel has ever made to the Palestinians, 95% of the land, Arafat rejecting it, so the talks collapsed. And also, Arafat's leadership itself seems to me to have come in question by the Palestinians when they began the stone throwing after Sharon's march to the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, or the Haram
Al-Aqsa, yeah.
So I want you to amplify, because in a way, what happened after the Camp David talks was what you'd predicted what would happen at the time of Oslo.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think the problem during that whole decade of Oslo, from '93 on, is that they were, thanks to the Americans, let's put it this way, and people like Dennis Ross, they created a kind of space that was completely illusory. It was called the peace process, right? And that was more and more distant from the reality that most Palestinians were living. Their land was being lost at a terrifying speed. Barak himself, who made this famous generous offer, which he had no right to make in the first place, it wasn't his land to offer. You know, I mean, it was illegally taken land, and so, I mean, the word generous offer is outrageous in this context, totally inappropriate. He had implanted more settlements than any other prime minister, including Netanyahu, before him. Okay, so that was happening. There was an impoverishment of daily life. You know, that there was a greater rate of unemployment. More and more people were living below $2 a day, which is the poverty line. It went up to about 40% during those years. Movement was impossible. You know, the closures became more and more impeded life more and more. And from the moment that Barak took office as the great, I remember I was in New York in the spring of '99, just after his election. I happened to be a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and I was invited to attend a meeting lunch for King Abdullah of Jordan, right? The young king. And most of what he had to say at that meeting was how enthusiastic and how optimistic they all were that Barak was coming in, forgetting about Barak's background, you know, who he had killed, things he had done, and so on and so forth. And they were waiting for him to do things. And then it was quite extraordinary that from the moment he took office until Camp David, the Israelis did not move one soldier from any of the occupied territories in flagrant contravention of the Oslo process. They had overstepped the timetable by 5 years, 3 years at least, 96 to 99. They did nothing. And all the time the settlements were increasing. Second, they offered the Palestinians cantons, basically, that were separated by Israeli roads and settlements and so on, so that you couldn't really see it as a continuous whole. And, you know, depending on how you calculate it, it was nowhere near 95%, which is what, you know, Thomas Friedman and some of the other columnists have said. It was much, much, much less. It was closer to 40 or 50%. Why? Because the Israelis and the Americans with them in this illusory process had invented, had produced a scheme that was positively Kafkaesque in its complexity, all the time presenting to the world a picture of great simplicity. We are moving towards peace. In the end, the Palestinians will have their independent state. At the same time, the other side of it, a much more complicated narrative, where instead of giving back Palestinians land, which is what people thought was happening, they gave bits of land, and they called it Area A, which never amounted to more than 16 or 17% of the whole. But Area A was bounded by Area B, which was jointly controlled by Palestinians and Israelis, but entrances and exits were Israelis, and security for Area A and Area B was under the control of the Israelis. Then there was Area C, which was everything that was left, which was mostly Israeli, the settlements, the military area, and so on and so forth. So the process was totally meaningless. What the Palestinians were getting back, and Arafat was accepting, and his leaders and so on, were accepting, were smaller and smaller bits of land, entailed for generations to come, just like, you know, property in a Jane Austen novel, where, you know, nobody, I mean, you know, or Bleak House, journalist versus journalist. You know, nothing ever, you never see anything because it's all, you know, it's salamied out into tiny little pieces. And we were told that this was peace. So I think this is what brought the whole thing down. And finally, and to me most important, there never was the realization that some of us had that, how shall I put it? There was a fundamental irreconcilable between Israelis, or the Zionist movement, and Palestinians. It wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about living in the past. It wasn't about all this other stuff. It really was about land. And unless you devise a category by which land is not exclusively owned, there's no hope. And what the Israelis were doing, and have done since the beginning, since the end of the 19th century until now, as the Zionist movement, was to take more and more land, and Palestinians have lost more and more land. And there's no way of reconciling between these two sort of opposing movements. One losing and dispossessing, and the other one, losing land and being dispossessed, and the other one taking more. And that's where I came to the conclusion that the only sensible resolution, given the obstinacy and the obduracy of the Israelis, who had so much power thanks to the United States, that they could afford to ignore the facts and reality, was to think about a way in which they could live together as equals, not on a partitioned land, but as equals on a land called Palestine, or Palestine-Israel, depending on it, in which people were equal and not defined by their ethnos or by their religion. But this is very difficult for, above all, American Jews. I think many Israelis would accept that. But American Jews, I think, are the main obstacle in this, because for them, Israel is a kind of secular religion, and it has to be a place to which they can retire or return or retreat or whatever. And they resist this idea. But there's no other way you can deal with the Palestinians as an actuality without thinking in terms of equality. I believed for a long time in the proposition that you could partition the land again, as the British tried to do in 1947 and 48. But partition brings more problems, as we know from India and Pakistan, we know from Ireland, we know from Cyprus, you know, that if you keep partitioning the land, you either propagate and continue the conflict, or you resolve nothing, as the case was in Lebanon. They fought the civil war, 150,000 people were killed, and they're back to where they started from, in a kind of, you know,
many Israelis would say, though, that what you're talking about means the end of the Jewish state. And they don't want to give up the Jewish state. Not
necessarily. If they want to have a Jewish state, which has a kind of primary importance for Jews, I have nothing against that. But they can't have a Jewish state which contains Arabs. I mean, the solution to that problem of a Jewish state is to kick out all the Arabs. That's why.
That's Benny Morris's solution.
I beg pardon?
That's Benny Morris's solution.
Well, Benny Morris's solution, it's Sharon's solution, it's Eitam's solution. It's, you know, a lot of people believe that that's the only way to do it. And I'm against that. I neither want to throw out every Jew who came to Palestine after 1948 or whatever the formula is, nor do I want Palestinians to be thrown out again. So I say, listen, isn't it possible, I mean, just rationally, isn't it possible that you can live in any way you choose? If you want to live as a Jew, you can do that. But you cannot ignore the presence in your midst of another people who have been there and have, you know, rights to existence there for at least as long as you have. I mean, you know, I've studied the history of Palestine, and actually the period of Jewish ascendancy in Palestine is very short historically. I mean, you know, it's about 200 years between the end.
Kingdom.
Well, the Israelite kingdom, but there were many other kingdoms, and they were never the only people there. They had ascendancy during the period of the kingdoms, right? It amounts to about 200 years, but in the meantime there were Greeks, there were Byzantines, there were Turks, there were Crusaders, and so on and so forth. So who knows? Who knows who is purely Jewish and purely Arab, etc.? It's basically a mixture. But to decide by draconian means that only Jews have the right to this land, and it's written in the Old Testament, that's fantasy. For me, the most dramatic thing that occurred in the last 5 years was the proposition in Parliament put forward by Meretz about 3 years ago, that as an optional component of the Israeli baccalaureate, the high school degree, they should be encouraged or offered the opportunity to read Palestinian literature and the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. They went hysterical. They didn't want that. Why should we do that? And that struck me as a terrible augury for the future, because, I mean, if you can't admit into your consciousness the existence of another people, then, I mean, you're really on the road to ruin of some kind. And I felt that my role has been to precisely to make it possible through rational means for Jews to admit the existence of Palestinians and for Palestinians to admit the existence of Jews, to think in terms of equality, to think in terms of citizenship, rather than in terms of, alas, which has gone completely against my formula, to think in terms of nations and blood and language and all those potentially divisive things. It's been very, very hard.
But the reaction to the Meret's proposal to teach Darwish poems in the Israeli curriculum is evidence that what you're talking about is a utopian idea.
Yeah, it is utopian. Yeah, it is. But, I mean, look at the alternative. The alternative has been bloodletting on a scale that no one can afford. I mean, the Israelis think they can afford it, but I think they're banking too heavily on unlimited United States munificence. Who knows with these people in the White House and people afterwards? They're counting on the fact that Palestinians in the end will give up. They're not going to give up. I mean, that seems to be as absolutely clear to me as. And there's not even a formula for them to give up. All that's being offered them is that they negate themselves. I mean, that's not. So I think the alternative is much, much worse than the so-called utopian, and vision, or at least the utopian proposition. But I think, on the other hand, that if one could multiply these kinds of efforts, such as mine, I think the chances of success are far greater than people suspect. But that's all that's before us. There aren't too many other offerings on the plate.
Now, to go back to the beginning of the present Intifada, I said earlier that it seemed to me to be just as much against the leadership of Yasser Arafat, who subsequently co-opted it to protect himself. What is it directed against now? It seems to be sporadic, inchoate, suicide bombings, still some mass demonstrations, but fewer and fewer because of the curfews and the closures. Where is it headed? What's its strategy?
Well, I don't think it's headed anywhere. I think it's mostly fueled by defiance. I don't think that'll stop. There is, I think one would be foolish to deny it, there is a considerable amount of religious and nationalistic fervor, which comes out in, to my way of thinking, useless acts of destruction. I mean, to show the Israelis that, we exist, and that no matter what you do, there are going to be responses. You can't eliminate everything that we do, which is what the Israelis have been trying to do. There are two inhuman logics really at work. And I think it's very important for us, for Palestinians, to show not only that suicide bombings are useless, but also to show that at the same time that they are really intimately tied in the same dialectic with Israeli tactics, which are equally useless. And I think that you might say the silver lining in the cloud is that this is only the surface, that beneath the surface, I'm convinced, and I know, insofar as one can know these things, that there are other movements developing, which are, you might say, at the level of civil society. I mean, most of the institutions of the authority have disappeared. The police force doesn't exist anymore, the incarceration, the corruption, all of that is now, let's say, informal. It's no longer planted in the center of Palestinian life. In the meantime, with all the difficulties that they experience, the schools are still open, the universities function, the medical services, the ambulances, the health centers, etc., have great difficulties, mostly caused by the Israelis. Nevertheless, they continue to provide services. There's a huge network in the villages of medical relief, and that's entirely a civil sort of self-help project done by Palestinians, completely outside the authority. By Mustafa Barghouti. Outside the authority and having nothing to do with the ordinary NGO network of sponsorship by the Swedes or the Germans and so on and so forth. And there is a dawning awareness, despite the fragmentation of the land, by these closures, this vicious system of 250 barricades, there's a dawning awareness that if we don't do it ourselves, nobody's going to do it. Arafat can't do anything. Arafat is now, I think, more or less completely neglected. And I've been pushing for, and I think I'm making a slight headway, for a constituent assembly, an assembly that itself provides its own legitimacy, you know, by asking people who represent segments of the community to come together and meet and establish a constitution, which of course Arafat has always prevented.
Would this be all Palestinians?
All Palestinians,
so
yeah. I mean,
refugees?
Well, insofar as it's possible, but I think if it were done on the West Bank and Gaza, let's say in Palestine, it could be a model for the reconstitution, let's say, of the National Council, which was also Arafatian PLO, let's call it device. But it played an important role, but it's obviously its role is over. So I think that is the possibility of the future for local Palestinians. And then second, I think there's a dawning awareness that without working with like-minded Israelis, creating like-minded Israelis, we can go nowhere. The Arabs are really hopeless. There's no, I mean, Arab sympathizers are there by the millions, obviously. People in the street who sympathize with the Palestinians, outraged at what's happened and so on. That's fine. But politically, they provide very little. Where are the demonstrators now? They got tired, and they were repressed so much at home that they went back to their own problems in Cairo and Amman and Beirut and so on and so forth. So in the end, it's us. It's us and the Israelis. And I've been encouraging, seeking out Israelis. And there I've been very helped, you know, in a completely informal way by my friend Barenboim, who was the only Israeli, quite strikingly, to volunteer his services. Now, he's not an anti-Zionist. He's a very, very visible, you know, incredibly gifted musician who has been all of his life an Israeli. Of course, he's lived abroad. And like many other people, he's disgusted with the occupation and with, you know, he thinks everything went wrong after '67. Fine, that's all you need, is that sense. And quite on his own, he volunteered his services, you know, partly through his friendship with me, to, in '99, play a recital on the West Bank. And he did it. He played in Birzeit University. And it was difficult to convince them, because the only Israelis they had known were the army. And here was this great artist coming to play free, a real concert, not kiddie pieces, before an invited audience, that there was always fear of some extremist throwing something or, you know, causing some problem. But it went very smoothly. And then again, this last spring in March, he went and played a concert in Ramallah organized by Badruti. And I, you know, through the mobile phone, you can put people together. And we're thinking of expanding this to include, you know, young musicians and, you know, not specifically political as such, not with a program, you know, like we want a unified state or we want two states or anything like that, but just the idea that there can be a front on symbolical terms, on a symbolical level rather, of people with common interests and destinies working together in ways that open up these completely constricted and completely stalemated antagonistic positions that now exist. I think it can be done.
There are organizations like Yesh Gavul, Gush Shalom, Rabbis for Peace,
yes.
Committee Against Home Demolitions, all Israeli civil society,
right.
Small but significant.
Right.
Do you think, though, on the other hand, that they might give Palestinians false hope that all of Israeli society is like this?
No, I don't think
they can have a dialogue.
No, I don't think anybody's fooled. I mean, everybody understands, you know, the overwhelming presence of the army, and, you know, when a city like Nablus is invaded by 500 tanks, you know, there's no illusion that Rabbis for Peace or the Committee Against House Demolition represents Israel. No, they're obviously small people. But what is to me deeply significant is how scared the Zionist propaganda is running now. I mean, they're trying to put this anti-colonial struggle, which is what it is, you see, on the level of the Holocaust. I mean, saying that the future and existence of the Jewish people is at stake, not just in Israel, but in the United States. When New York Magazine runs an entire dossier suggesting that there may be another Auschwitz around the corner, and when Nat Hentoff, who's a liberal sort of First Amendment champion, makes a statement that he wouldn't be surprised if loudspeakers in Times Square summoned the Jews out of their houses to line up in Times Square. When you make statements like that, you realize that something very fundamental is being challenged, and that is the idea that somehow this state can exist extraterritorially, regardless of the consequences of its history and so on and so forth. And that period, I think, is coming to an end. So insofar as those changes are on the horizon, I'm much more optimistic than the events on the ground would suggest. I mean, what with Netanyahu now joining the government and another election that will probably bring Likud, more power.
But what about the effects of an Iraq war?
Well, that's the great imponderable. It's hard to know what the fallout of that may be, but I mean, it certainly won't be. It certainly won't be good. It may be, it may be that the drawing of a new map, which is, I think, what Bush and his people really want, and I think what Sharon wants, with a kind of naked hegemony of, not hegemony, naked domination of the United States and Israel over the oil and over the region, which have been, of course, U.S. policy from the beginning. It's now that the gloves have been taken off. That might polarize things more clearly for the inhabitants of the region. You see, I mean, a lot of the thinking of this, it's a very interesting issue. A lot of the thinking about the Middle East has really been extraterritorial. It's been done by people who are not there, by expatriates, by Zionists who live in Washington and New York and London and so on and so forth. And I think what this might do is, with a dramatic change in the landscape, which is certain to ensue, whether because of Iraq or Saudi Arabia or Syria or any of these countries, I think there will be a very dramatic change of focus. And people will become aware of the fact that, they have a stake in their land, that a kind of new concreteness descends, and people no longer think in terms of dimensions having to do with God and the Old Testament, and I think in the face of this, for example, the Islamist movement in the Middle East, which has been on the wane for a very long time, despite what the media says, will decrease even more as people realize that they have to deal with the here and now, and not with the hereafter, and not with religious politics, and not with Islamic or Jewish or whatever states that is being posited by these movements. And I think it will become a more secular, in all senses, bad and good, of that word. And I think that's a distinct possibility. I don't think the plans, the blueprints, for federalized Iraq and a democratized, I think that's all not paper nonsense done by callow and rather the jejune thinkers who
the Orientalists.
Well, they're either Orientalists or they're just, they're opportun. I think they're opportunists much more than that. Orientalists in more sense, as we know from Kipling.
I'm going to personalize it a bit, this whole problem. And I'm thinking of a poem that Mahmoud Darwish wrote before he went back to live in Palestine. And it was, as I recall, what am I to do then? What am I to do without exile, without long nights staring into the water? What about you? Have you come to depend on exile, to prefer it?
Well, I don't know any other state. I mean, it makes no sense to me now at my age and with my declining health to think in terms of making some kind of terminal move. And I've been very interested, not for very subtle reasons, in something that I call late style. I'm writing a book, which I hope I can sometime finish, on the last period of various thinkers and writers and musicians and artists' lives. And it seems to me there are two alternatives, and the one I've chosen to study in my book is the more severe and difficult one, but to me the more interesting one. There is the idea that as you grow older, you become more reconciled, you settle your affairs, and this image of the sage or the older person who is settled his quarrels, rid himself or herself, as it may be, of worldly goods, and settles into a kind of holy state of understanding and acceptance. Oedipus at Colonus, for example, or the late plays of Shakespeare, Prospero at the end of The Tempest, returning to life and accepting the fullness of time and so on. There's another alternative, which is that of the late period as being one of greater intransigence, more complexity, more awareness of the irreconcilability of life, that life is not a dialectical process, as Lukács and others used to say that if you think in terms of a synthesis, you can achieve it, even if it's only a psychological one. But rather that there's a endless discovery of new complexities and new difficulties, and I think that's what really interests me. I mean, it's not that I don't feel any more comfortable with it than I did earlier. I still feel out of sorts and at odds. You know, and anger plays a fairly major role in my thinking about, for example, Palestine. And well, it's not just anger, but you know, it's one is exercised. One's
so you're still raging against the night.
Yeah, well, I don't know, raging. No, I try. On the contrary, I try to put it as sensibly as I can. But I don't think one loses one's ambition to try to indicate to people, you know, that there are other alternatives. That's what I'm trying to say, that you don't just shut down at the end, that you try to open up even as you're going down, which I'm certainly doing. But you're trying to open up avenues that you can leave behind for younger people and friends and comrades and so on and so forth. I think in terms rather like that than in the others, in the sort of harmonious terms.